The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous song above the nurses' station at Seattle General, a sound like electricity trapped in glass, relentless and slightly deranged. Megan O'Brien had been working night shift for 3 months now, and the hum had become her metronome, her baseline, the rhythm underneath everything else. She was 37 years old and rebuilt herself from rubble with the same precision she used to fold discharge paperwork, careful, methodical, no wasted motion. 3 months employed as a registered nurse with no one asking too many questions about the 5-year gap in her resume. 3 months of being invisible, which was exactly how she liked it. The night shift at Seattle General stretched from 1900 to 0700, a 12-hour rotation that suited people with ghosts. People who didn't sleep anyway. People who didn't mind the way the hospital changed after dark, becoming something quieter and more honest, the fluorescent glare peeling away the institutional veneer to reveal what was underneath: suffering, usually, and sometimes grace. Megan moved between patient rooms with a pronounced limp on her left side, an old injury that made younger nurses assume she was fragile, sympathetic. They didn't see the economy of motion in how she transferred patients, the way she never used more than one hand when she needed 0 wasted steps. They didn't see the muscle memory that moved her through trauma situations like she'd been doing it her whole life instead of just part of it. The emergency department smelled like antiseptic and floor wax and something underneath both of those, copper, maybe, or rust. The scent of old blood that never completely washed out of hospital tile, no matter how many mop rotations went across it. Megan had learned to breathe through her mouth on night shift. Her scrubs were navy blue with a small hospital logo on the chest, nothing personalized, nothing that signaled anything other than basic competence. Her badge hung from a thin lanyard that had broken twice and been knotted back together. She wore it anyway. At 0247 hours, the paramedics brought him in on a stretcher, radio traffic crackling ahead of them like warning shots. Chest trauma. Potential internal bleeding. No wallet. No phone. No identification of any kind except a single dog tag hanging from a broken chain around his neck, the metal glinting under the harsh bay lights like a piece of truth that nobody wanted. The paramedics rattled off vitals: blood pressure 94/58, heart rate 128, respiratory rate 22, and Megan was already moving, already thinking 2 steps ahead about for access and imaging protocol and whether this man had a family who knew where he was. Trauma Bay 3, she said quietly to the resident who was hovering, slightly lost. Not a question. Not a request. She didn't use please with residents during emergency situations. Please implied negotiation. She meant, bed 3, move now. They transferred him with practiced efficiency for people coordinating without speaking, the choreography of a hospital that had seen enough emergencies to know how to move without bumping into each other. His shirt came off in pieces. Megan saw old scars on his chest first, surgical, precise, the kind that came from someone who'd been cut open and sewn back together by experts. Then she saw his face, and her hands went completely still. Not stopped. Still. There was a difference. Still was a choice. Stopped was involuntary. Megan chose stillness the way a sniper chooses a breath, controlled and deliberate, a momentary pause that meant nothing to anyone watching because she was already moving again, already cutting away his remaining clothes, already reaching for the 16-gauge angiocath she would need for fluid resuscitation. But for exactly 2 seconds, her hands had recognized him. Colonel Marcus Hale. 5 years ago. Tikrit. The court-martial that had destroyed her career in the Army Rangers, the hearing room where he'd sat at the table with 3 other officers and listened to testimony about the mission in Jolin district that had gone sideways, listened to her explanations about how the call-out had been ambiguous, how the IED had detonated before she could even reach the casualty, how 2 of her unit had died because the intelligence was bad. Not because she was bad. But he hadn't cared about the distinction. Colonel Marcus Hale had voted to relieve her of command and medically discharge her on the grounds of psychological unfitness, and she'd spent 5 years teaching herself that people like him didn't exist anymore in her life. And here he was, bleeding into the mattress of Trauma Bay 3. She worked D4 into the antecubital vein without hesitation, her hands knew what to do even when her mind was running parallel programs, one focused on the immediate crisis, one focused on the fact that fate sometimes had a sense of timing that felt like a threat. She initiated 2 lines, hung fluid wide open, ordered the tech to get him hooked to continuous cardiac monitoring. He had a faint pulse but no reaction to stimuli, no reflex response, his pupils blown and fixed. The kind of patient who might not have another hour. She wasn't going to let him die. Not yet. Not before she figured out what he was doing in a hospital in Raleigh with a broken dog tag and no identification. As she lifted his left wrist to check for additional injuries, her fingers caught on something beneath his watch, a bracelet, barely visible, the kind of thing most people would miss entirely. Medical alert, superficially. But the marking on it was wrong. The coding was wrong. The metallic sheen was too deliberate. Megan had seen that marking exactly once before, on a Marine she'd treated in the forward operating base at Camp Fallujah, an officer who'd been taking experimental medications that didn't exist in standard military pharmacopoeia. The kind of trials that didn't have ethics review boards because the ethics committees were deliberately bypassed. She photographed it with a chart camera that hung from her neck, a device she used to document injuries and track wound progression. She angled it carefully, making sure the bracelet was in clear focus, making sure the coding was legible. Then she documented her findings in her handwritten notes, the one she was meticulous about, not because she believed in perfect documentation, but because she believed in leaving a trail. Just in case. By the time she finished the initial assessment, Dr. Ashford was already stepping into the trauma bay, which was unusual. The hospital administrator didn't typically respond to John Doe admissions. But Dr. Ashford was that kind of man, the kind who appeared when something might become his problem, the kind who had a network of calls that alerted him to unusual situations. He was tall enough to look down at most people, grey-haired in a way that was supposed to convey trustworthiness, with cufflinks made of what looked like platinum and the kind of watch that cost more than Megan's car payment. "Status," he said, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to being answered immediately. "Stable for the moment," Megan said, still focused on the monitor. "Bilateral breath sounds present. Sinus rhythm." She didn't mention the bracelet. Didn't mention the coding. Didn't mention that she'd photographed it or documented it. She simply continued her work as if he were any other administrator walking through, which meant keeping her eyes on the vital signs and not on his face. But she heard him move to the patient's side. Heard him lean down. And then she heard something shift in the air of the room, a change in pressure, like something in the temperature had dropped 5 degrees even though the trauma bay was warm. She glanced up, and Dr. Ashford was looking at her with an expression that was worse than anger. Worse than suspicion. It was the look of someone whose calculations had suddenly gone wrong, someone who'd just realized that a variable he thought was stable had a different value than he expected. His eyes moved to the chart in her hands. Specifically to the handwritten notes where she documented the bracelet's existence and described the coding with clinical precision. "You're done here," he said quietly. Not to her. To the resident. To the tech. To everyone except her. They left like students excused from class, quick and uncertain, the kind of exit that suggested Dr. Ashford wielded the kind of authority that didn't require explanation. When the door closed behind them, he didn't move away from the patient. Didn't demand the chart. Didn't do anything except stand there, studying Colonel Hale's face with the intensity of someone reprocessing information, someone running calculations. "You will not document that bracelet," he said finally, his voice the same pleasant tone he'd used moments before, which somehow made it worse. "You will not mention it to anyone. You will not speak about what you observed to your colleagues or your supervisor. Are we understanding each other, Miss O'Brien?" She didn't correct him about the name. Didn't flinch at how he deployed it, the kind of familiarity that wasn't friendly. She simply resumed her work, adjusting for flow rates, scanning the monitor for any sign of deterioration. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. And then the real nightmare began. The room went quiet the moment Dr. Ashford walked through the door of room for 12. Megan stood at the foot of the grandmother's bed, updating the monitor readings, when his voice cut through the fluorescent hum like a scalpel. "Nurse O'Brien, we need to discuss your charting from last night. in front of witnesses. 2 residents flanked him, notepads already open. The grandmother's daughter pulled her purse closer, suddenly vigilant. Megan's hand stilled on the vital signs monitor. Dr. Ashford held up the handwritten notes, her notes, the ones describing the classified bracelet, the funding codes, the pharmaceutical trial markers that didn't belong in any civilian hospital record. His voice dripped with concern, the kind of concern that melted like honey over broken glass. You documented speculation about funding sources. Conspiracy theories about pharmaceutical trials. He turned to the family, shaking his head with practiced disappointment. This is exactly the kind of documentation that undermines patient care. The grandmother's daughter stared at Megan with sudden distrust. Are you a nurse or a detective, Limpy? Dr. Ashford asked it conversationally, as if asking about the weather. The residents didn't flinch. The family didn't interrupt. The room absorbed the nickname like it had always belonged there. Megan's jaw tightened, just enough for anyone watching to know she'd felt it. She took one measured breath. 1. The kind of breath they teach you in the field when the world is trying to break you. A single tear traced down her cheek. Not a tremor. Not a voice crack. Just water sliding down her face like rain on a windshield, unstoppable and unavoidable. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Dr. Ashford. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave. Truth doesn't change because you hide it. The residents exchanged glances. The grandmother's daughter leaned back in her chair. Dr. Ashford's smile went thin and sharp as a razor blade. See me after your shift about proper documentation protocols, Nurse O'Brien. He left the room the way a predator leaves a watering hole, confident, unhurried, already planning the next strike. Megan finished her rounds without speaking. Her limp was more pronounced by mid-morning, always worse when she was holding everything inside, when her hip bore the weight of silence along with her body. She'd broken it on an IED run in Tikrit, 7 fragments still embedded near the surgical pins, and pain was information. The worse the pain, the harder she was clenching. She was clenching very hard today. By afternoon, the break room felt like a funeral parlor. Megan sat down with her coffee at 2:22 p.m., the same table where she'd eaten lunch with Patricia Chen, David Kumar, and Sarah Mills for the past 3 months. They were there. They saw her. And then, without a word, without a glance, they stood up. Patricia gathered her things first, deliberately, slowly, making sure Megan understood it wasn't accident but choice. David and Sarah followed, moving to a table across the room near the window. The message was clear and surgical: don't sit with us. Megan sat alone for 30 minutes. The coffee went cold in her hands, skin forming on the surface like a scar. She could have walked over. Could have demanded an explanation. Instead, she sat perfectly still, watching them laugh at something on David's phone, watching them not look at her. The break room hummed with the sound of the ice machine cycling, each cube dropping like a small verdict. Not your people anymore. Not your tribe. Not safe. When she stood to leave, her hip screamed. She moved through the discomfort without acknowledging it, the way soldiers do. Pain was just a message her body was sending, and she didn't have to listen. By the end of her shift, her name was on the public write-up board in the main hallway. The one every staff member passed during rounds. The one visible to visitors and family members. Megan O'Brien, failure to follow documentation protocols, written warning. Not private. Not professional. Public execution disguised as administration. Dr. Ashford stood across the hallway, arms crossed, watching her read it. She felt his eyes before she saw him. That sixth sense you develop in combat zones, the weight of attention, the predator's gaze, the knowing that someone was measuring your weakness. She met his eyes. He smiled. The kind of smile that said he was just getting started. See you tomorrow, Limpy. Or maybe you won't. I'm restructuring the schedule. His voice was pleasant. Conversational. We're seeing some staffing gaps. ICU coverage is being reassigned. You'll be moving to pediatrics starting next week. We need your skills with children. He said it like a gift. Like he was doing her a favor. Like taking away her access to the unit where the John Doe was dying wasn't calculated psychological warfare. Over the next 72 hours, Dr. Ashford executed his dismantling with surgical precision. Day 1, she arrived for her shift to find herself banned from ICU access. Temporary reassignment, the charge nurse said, not meeting her eyes. Pediatrics instead, 12 beds of ear infections, asthma exacerbations, and children screaming while their parents filmed on phones. A demotion wrapped in bureaucratic language. When Megan passed the ICU doors at 4:19 p.m., she caught a glimpse of room for 12 through the window. The John Doe was still there, unconscious, attached to machines she could no longer access. Dr. Ashford was standing over his bed, syringe in hand, administering medication to an unconscious patient with no nursing staff present. No documentation. No witnesses except Megan, watching from behind the door's window like a ghost locked out of her own morgue. Day 2, her schedule changed. Rotating shifts, nights, then swing shift, then days again. No consistency. No chance to build continuity with any team. Each shift, she'd arrive to find her locker reassigned, her code access downgraded, her parking spot given to someone else. It was chaos dressed up as restructuring. She spent an hour of her night shift searching for the supply closet, finally finding it relocated to the 3rd floor. By day 3, she'd stopped trying to establish routine. Routine was a luxury Dr. Ashford had decided she didn't deserve. That 3rd day, she overheard him on the phone in his office. The door was half open, deliberately, she realized. He wanted her to hear. Yes, County Memorial, about 3 hours away. Rural facility, good reputation, strong community ties. I have a nurse who might be better suited to your environment. Pause. Megan O'Brien. She's been with us 3 months. Excellent technical skills, but she's struggling with our documentation standards. Complex personality. Tends to overthink situations. I think she'd benefit from a smaller setting. 3 hours away. County Memorial was in the mountains, staffed by 12 nurses and 1 rotating surgeon. It was a graveyard for ambitious people. It was exactly where he wanted her. Megan made a mental catalogue of what she'd seen in the John Doe's chart during the brief moments she'd had access. The pharmaceutical company codes in his billing records. The medication dosing patterns that matched Phase 3 trial protocols. The blank spaces in his treatment orders where standard procedures should have been documented. The funding source marked confidential special designation. Someone was running unauthorized trials through Seattle General's medical records, and Dr. Ashford was the conductor. That night, reassigned to the ER instead of pediatrics, the schedule was deliberately chaotic, impossible to predict. She watched from across the department as Dr. Ashford personally administered medication to the unconscious John Doe during a routine vitals check. No nurses present. No documentation in real time. He was running the trial solo, which meant the trials existed nowhere official. Nowhere prosecutable. Nowhere anyone could touch. He saw her watching. Their eyes met across 30 feet of beeping monitors and rolling for stands. His expression didn't change, that was the terrifying part. He wasn't angry or nervous. He was calm. The kind of calm that comes from a man who'd eliminated every obstacle in his path before, who'd built a career on making problems disappear. His eyes promised her something very clear: you're next. Megan turned back to her patient, a drunk driver with a broken collarbone, and continued her assessment as if nothing had happened. But her hands had stopped trembling, and her breathing had steadied. Something had shifted in her chest, something that felt like the moment before a combat patrol recognizes the perimeter has been breached. The nightmare was becoming education. And she was finally starting to pay attention. The 4th reassignment in 4 days landed Megan on the graveyard rotation, the one nobody wanted. Skeleton crew. 2 nurses for the entire hospital. ICU locked down except for the code team and Dr. Ashford, who came through at irregular hours to adjust medications nobody knew about. The hospital at night was a different organism. Fluorescent shadows stretched across empty hallways. The intercom crackled with voices from other cities, other emergencies. The weight of silence pressed down like deep water. Megan clocked in at 2,100 hours. The ER was quiet. Too quiet. She'd worked enough nights to know that quiet was a liar. Quiet was the moment before everything changed. Her hip ached where the IED had shattered it 5 years ago in Tikrit, the nerve still sending phantom signals at 2 a.m. like soldiers who hadn't gotten the order to stand down. She'd learned to read that pain like a radio frequency. It meant something was coming. The charge nurse, a burnt-out RN named Derek who'd been at Seattle General for 19 years and looked 90, nodded at her from the desk. Code team's understaffed tonight. Hospital-wide staff call. Only you, me, and Chen on the floor. 3 nurses for 100 beds. Megan didn't respond. There was nothing to say. This was Dr. Ashford's design. She'd recognized the pattern 3 days ago when he'd reassigned her to graveyard, then day shift, then afternoon, then night again. Each shift a deliberate punch. Each rotation meant she arrived tired, disoriented, unable to document clearly or challenge anything. The nightmare was becoming education. And she was finally starting to pay attention. By 02:45 hours, the ER had settled into the kind of drowsy chaos that preceded catastrophe. A homeless veteran with pneumonia in Bay 3. A kid with appendicitis in observation. The ventilator in ICU wheezed its mechanical rhythm through the speakers, a sound like something drowning slowly, methodically. Megan sat in the break room with stale coffee that tasted like copper and watched the ceiling tiles breathe in and out with the building's fax system. Her phone sat dark on the table. No messages. No updates on her transfer application to the rural facility 3 hours north. No word from the licensing board about her documentation protocols. The silence in her scrub pocket where her military pin used to sit felt louder than any alarm. At 0318 hours, Derek found her restocking the trauma supplies in Bay 7. You good? You're limping worse than usual. I'm fine, Megan said. Not a lie. A military answer. Completion of mission regardless of damage sustained. She'd learned to sort pain into categories: pain that required intervention, pain that was just information, pain that meant nothing because the work continued anyway. Derek nodded and left. He knew better than to push. Most people did, eventually. The code alarm hit at 0320 hours like a physical thing, a siren through the intercom that made the fluorescent lights flicker. Code blue, ICU 4. Code blue, ICU 4. A woman's voice, clinical and detached. The kind of voice that had announced death 1,000 times and would announce it 1,000 more. Megan moved. Her hands found the code cart, muscle memory overriding the exhaustion. Derek was already running toward the elevators. Chen, the other nurse, was 2 steps behind him. The code team should have been mobilizing from their break room on the 3rd floor. Should have been moving with the organized chaos of people who'd done this 300 times. Should have been there in 40 seconds, maximum. They weren't. Megan reached ICU for alone. The door stood open. The room smelled like antiseptic and something else, the bitter chemical signature of medications being administered manually, without documentation. Without records. The man in the bed was the John Doe. The one she'd been forbidden from treating. The one whose classified bracelet had triggered Dr. Ashford's arrival like a summons from somewhere above the hospital hierarchy. His oxygen saturation was 62. Dropping. His chest wasn't rising. The ventilator had disconnected, someone had pulled the tube free. Not an accident. The room was too deliberate, too still. Colonel Marcus Hale. The man who'd sat across the desk from her 5 years ago in a tent outside Tikrit while she was still in traction. Who'd signed the court-martial papers with a pen that probably cost more than her first month's rent. Who'd looked at her like she was a problem that needed administrative resolution. He was dying now with his lips parted slightly, his face a map of something that might have been fear or might have been nothing at all. The crash cart was across the hall. Unplugged. The phone line to the code team had been cut, not dramatically, not with violence, but with the precise efficiency of someone who knew exactly how hospitals worked. How systems could be manipulated. How a patient could be allowed to die quietly on the graveyard shift when there were no witnesses except the nurse he'd destroyed. Dr. Ashford appeared in the doorway. His white coat was immaculate. His expression was a mask of professional concern. "You're not assigned to ICU, Nurse O'Brien. Step away from the patient." Megan looked at the monitor. 58, falling. Tension pneumothorax, his chest had collapsed from the disconnected ventilator, pressure building in the pleural space with nowhere to go. She had 90 seconds. Maybe less. The clinical part of her mind ran the calculation: without intervention, his heart would stop. Without immediate decompression, his lungs would rupture. Without documentation, this would be just another John Doe who didn't make it. Another casualty of understaffing and bad luck. She looked at Dr. Ashford. At the way his jaw was tight, anticipating victory. At the way his eyes held a kind of hunger, not for her submission, but for proof that she would choose protocol over survival. That she would be what he'd made her, just a nurse. "No," Megan said. Her voice came out level. Not loud. Not angry. The kind of no that came from somewhere deeper than emotion, from the part of her that had triaged wounds in a combat zone while rounds kicked up dust, the part that made decisions when there was no time for permission. She moved to the trash in the corner and grabbed the plastic packaging from a cafeteria food tray, MRE wrapping, waterproof and flexible. Her hands moved on their own, the way they had in Tikrit when the world was chaos and her hands were the only thing between a dying soldier and the void. She'd done this before. Had sealed a sucking chest wound with plastic and tape while artillery shook the air. Had whispered to men who couldn't hear her that she wasn't going to let them go. The needle. 14-gauge catheter. Between the second and third rib, mid-clavicular line, the space she could find in the dark, on a moving target, with shaking hands. Her hands weren't shaking now. They were steady as surgical steel. She drove the needle home and heard the hiss of air escaping, pressure releasing like someone taking their first real breath in years. The sound of a system finding equilibrium. She sealed the site with the plastic, taped it down with quick, economical movements. "Get me tape. Full width. Now." Dr. Ashford didn't move. Megan's eyes found his across the bed. The look was different now, not deferential, not asking, not performing the role she'd been cast in. "I said now, doctor." His hand moved without his permission, reaching for the tape dispenser on the wall. His face had gone white, not with compassion, but with the recognition of what was happening. A nurse had just stepped outside her scope of practice. Had just performed an emergency medical procedure that was technically his domain. Had just openly defied him in front of whatever institutional authority he'd built in this hospital. The monitor changed. The pressure normalized. The oxygen saturation climbed, 64. 71, 79. 88, stable. Megan's voice dropped to something barely audible, words meant only for the man in the bed. "Not like this. You don't get to die before you know the truth. Not before you understand what you took from me. Not like this." Her hands finished the work with the precision of someone who'd held lives together with nothing but knowledge and will. The improvised chest seal held. The ventilator reconnected. The man called John Doe existed in the space between death and whatever came next, his body sustained by the intervention of a woman he'd never bothered to know. The code team arrived at 0324 hours, 4 minutes after the crash alarm, 2 minutes after it was already over. Derek behind them, confused. Chen coming around the corner. All of them stopping when they saw Megan standing at the bedside, blood on her scrubs, hands steady at her sides, facing Dr. Ashford with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. His face held the expression of a man who'd just realized the game had changed. who'd expected submission and found something far more dangerous: clarity. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the monitor beeped once. Then again. Regular rhythm. Sinus. Alive. Dr. Ashford's office smelled like old leather and the kind of air conditioning that cost more than her entire monthly rent. Megan stood in the doorway, still in her scrubs, still smelling like antiseptic and adrenaline from the code blue 6 hours earlier. The termination letter lay centered on his mahogany desk like a blade. HR Director Monica Reeves sat to his left, her expression carefully neutral. Hospital Attorney James Park occupied the right chair, his briefcase closed but present, a promise of institutional weight. "Sit," Dr. Ashford said. Not a request. The word landed like a command from someone accustomed to obedience. She sat today. Her hip ached. It always ached after a double shift, but today the pain felt different, sharper, more insistent, as if her body was reminding her that 5 years of civilian life hadn't erased what Tikrit had done to her. Dr. Ashford slid the letter across the desk with 2 fingers, as though contamination was possible through paper alone. Megan O'Brien, you performed procedures outside your scope of practice as a registered nurse. His voice moved with practiced precision, each word weighted and placed. You demonstrated emotional instability and gross insubordination. You endangered a patient with unauthorized interventions. She didn't look at the letter. She looked at his hands instead. They were steady. Perfectly steady. The hands of a man who'd never held a soldier's helmet while their brain leaked out the back. The hands of a man who'd never had to choose between amputation and death in a dust storm. His hands were the hands of someone who believed the world operated according to rules he could enforce. The patient was crashing, Megan said. Her voice came out flat, clipped. Professional. The code team was delayed. By 7 minutes, James Park interjected, his pen hovering over a notepad. According to dispatch records, in a 7-minute window, cardiac arrest becomes brain death. Which is precisely why we have protocols. Dr. Ashford's eyes never left hers. You didn't follow them. You improvised. You performed a procedure outside your certification. Megan had performed that same procedure twice in Fallujah. Once in the back of a Humvee under sniper fire. Once in a bunker with artillery rolling overhead like thunder that wanted to kill you. Both times, the patient lived. Both times, no one had ever questioned her authority or her scope of practice. Both times, the world had been simpler. A person was dying. You kept them alive. You didn't consult a manual. You didn't check insurance coverage. You moved and they lived, or you hesitated and they died. This was different. This was a world where rules mattered more than results. My phone records show I contacted board members at 8 o'clock this morning. Dr. Ashford gestured at his desk phone, a device that suddenly felt less like technology and more like a weapon. I also contacted Dr. Patricia Holden at the State Licensing Authority at 8:15. Both conversations documented your scope violations and emotional instability. Megan's stomach dropped. Not because she was surprised. She'd known this was coming the moment he'd walked into the trauma bay and seen her with blood on her hands and a dying colonel who wasn't supposed to live. But hearing it stated aloud, hearing the evidence of his systematic work, the calls already made before he'd even told her she was fired, that landed differently. That meant it wasn't impulsive. That meant it was calculated. That meant he'd been building this case while she was still in her scrubs, still covered in Colonel Hale's blood, still high on adrenaline and the primal knowledge that she'd done the right thing. You're finished in this profession, Dr. Ashford said. Not cruel. Just factual. Like reading a weather report. I've documented everything. The state board will receive a formal complaint by end of business today. Your nursing license will be suspended pending investigation. You can expect the process to take approximately 4 to 6 months. By that time, the financial cost of legal representation combined with the damage to your professional reputation will ensure you don't practice nursing again in Washington. He slid another document across the desk. This one was thicker. This is the termination agreement. You sign it, you receive 2 weeks of severance. You refuse, we pursue the license suspension and add civil liability to your situation. The choice is yours, but I'd recommend you talk to an attorney. Not that it will help, but it's the customary courtesy. Megan thought of 5 years. 5 years of physical therapy where therapists worked on her hip and she said nothing about how it had been shattered. 5 years of rebuilding herself into someone who could work 12-hour shifts and pretend she wasn't always in pain. 5 years of suppressing every instinct, every memory of command, every part of herself that had ever worn a uniform. 5 years of being just a nurse. Nobody special. Nobody dangerous. Just someone who showed up and followed protocols and never, ever mentioned that she'd held a major artery together with her bare hands while rounds came down like hail. Her hands were steady as she picked up the pen. The pen itself was expensive, probably cost more than she made in an hour. She signed the document with a signature that looked like someone else's handwriting, smaller, less certain, the signature of a civilian who'd never commanded anything. You have through the end of your shift to clear your locker. Monica Reeves spoke for the first time. Security will escort you from the building. You're not to contact any staff members regarding this termination. Any communication can and will be documented as further grounds for license suspension. Megan stood. The movement was fluid, practiced. Military bearing dies hard, and even 5 years of civilian clothes couldn't fully erase the way a soldier moves when dismissed. Are we finished? We are, Dr. Ashford said. She walked out of his office without looking back. The locker room was empty when she arrived. Everyone had moved to day shift or gone home. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in a sickly white that made the lockers look like a morgue. Megan opened her locker, number 47, assigned to her on her first day 3 months ago, and stared at the contents. 2 pairs of backup scrubs. Her name badge, hanging from a lanyard with a small silver cross her sister had given her for nursing school. A photograph of her and Tyler from 3 years ago, before he'd gotten tall, before his voice had dropped, before everything had started to feel like something held together with tape and prayer. She pulled off her scrubs. The fabric was soft, worn from countless washings. Army fabric was different. Military uniforms held shape longer, designed to endure. These scrubs felt fragile by comparison. Civilian. Temporary. Like everything else. Megan folded them with hospital corners, the muscle memory of a soldier, creases sharp and precise, the kind of fold that could survive inspection, the kind of fold her drill sergeant had taught her when she was 19 years old and believed the world made sense. She placed them in the return bin, watching the fabric settle on top of someone else's discarded shift. Patricia Chen stood in the doorway. Head nurse. The woman who'd seen Megan's isolation happen in real time and done nothing to stop it. The woman who'd crossed the room when other nurses tried to speak to her, who'd scheduled her shifts to guarantee she'd never have backup on the floor, who'd participated in the systematic destruction of a colleague without ever raising her voice or breaking protocol. Neither of them spoke. Patricia's eyes moved from Megan's face to the empty locker to the folded scrubs in the return bin. The expression on her face was complicated, something between guilt and resignation, the look of someone who'd made a choice and knew exactly what it meant. Megan picked up her gym bag. Everything she'd brought to Seattle General in 3 months fit inside it. An extra pair of shoes. A water bottle. The photograph of Tyler. Her shift schedule from that first day, folded and forgotten at the bottom. She walked past Patricia without stopping. The parking lot lights flickered overhead, casting everything in sickly yellow-white. Puddles from the afternoon rain reflected the sky like shattered mirrors. Megan's car sat in the nurse parking section, a 12-year-old Honda Civic that had brought her from Portland to Raleigh 5 years ago, that had driven through rain and snow and summer heat without complaint. She reached for the door handle. Behind her, a truck pulled up. A Ford F-150, dark blue, the kind of truck that belonged to someone young and building something. Her son Tyler stepped out, his frame tall enough now that he had to duck slightly under the truck's door frame. In his hands, he carried a shadow box. Dark wood, glass front, the kind of thing that belonged on a wall in a memorial or a museum or a grandfather's den, not in anyone's locker or attic or secret place. Inside the shadow box were medals. Megan felt her throat constrict. "Tyler, don't." "Mom." He walked past her with the certain stride of someone who'd made a decision and wasn't going to unmake it. His voice carried across the parking lot, loud enough for the night security guard at the entrance booth to turn and look. "They need to see." He didn't wait for permission. He walked toward the administrative entrance where lights still burned in the upper windows, where Dr. Ashford was probably making more phone calls, probably documenting more evidence, probably ensuring that everything was neat and tidy and thoroughly destroyed. Megan followed. She couldn't do anything else. Tyler pushed through the double doors without knocking. The hallway was quiet, hospital quiet, the kind of quiet that happens after the chaos of day shift when most of the world is home and sleeping. His footsteps echoed against the tile. He climbed the stairs to the second floor where administration lived, all leather and mahogany and success, and he didn't stop. "Mom, they need to see these," he said again, louder this time. He walked into Dr. Ashford's office without knocking. Tyler pushed open the office door without knocking. His voice cut through the administrative silence like a blade through silk. "My mother is Major Megan O'Brien." The shadow box caught the fluorescent overhead light, medals catching and throwing gold across the dark wood of Dr. Ashford's desk. Head nurse Patricia Chen stood frozen in the doorway, her hands trembling as she read the nameplate on the folder Tyler had just placed there. 2 silver stars. Purple heart. Bronze star with Valor. Each word broke something in her chest that couldn't be repaired with an apology. The office door opened again. Not an invitation. An arrival. Federal Special Agent Crawford held his credentials like a knife, the leather case snapping open with authority that made the air pressure change in the room. Behind him, Special Agent Martinez carried a laptop, her expression the particular flatness that came from 6 weeks of watching financial records bleed into pharmaceutical trafficking. "Dr. James Ashford. We're investigating unauthorized pharmaceutical trials at this facility. Military intelligence contacted us when Colonel Hale regained consciousness and reported discrepancies in his treatment protocol." Crawford's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You're under investigation for distribution of experimental medications to federal patients without consent, falsification of medical records, and attempted murder of a protected witness." Dr. Ashford's attorney, James Park, stood immediately. His tailored suit suddenly looked expensive in the way that suggested he'd be paying for it himself now. "My client has no comment. I'm advising you not to speak." But it was already too late. The laptop screen lit up with Megan's personnel file. The hospital version. Not the real one. The corrupted one. Agent Martinez tapped the keyboard. "These entries were added this afternoon. Competency concerns retroactively filed. Psychological evaluations conducted by physicians who work 3 states away and have never met your employee. Incident report signed by nurses who are currently telling us they never filed them." She looked at Patricia Chen. "Isn't that right, Ms. Chen?" Patricia's voice shook. "He told me to avoid her. Said she was unstable. He changed the schedule himself so she'd never be near the patient." The words came like a confession that had been waiting 6 weeks to break free. David Kumar appeared in the doorway behind them, his face the color of old bone. One of the nurses who'd abandoned Megan in the break room, who'd walked away from her like she was contagious. "He told us she was stealing medications. That we should watch her." We believed him. His hands were fists at his sides. I believed him. Agent Martinez produced printed emails, each one a small death for Dr. Ashford's composure. Correspondence with Dentec Pharmaceuticals. Payments to a shell corporation registered under your wife's maiden name. $174,000 in 18 months. She paused. Let that number sit in the room like a body. Patient consent forms with forged signatures. Disconnected the code team phone line before Colonel Hale crashed. Moved the crash cart specifically to make emergency response impossible. You didn't just want him dead, Doctor. You wanted it to look like negligence. That's not, I never, Ashford's voice cracked. The sound of a man feeling his world collapse into dimensions he couldn't calculate his way out of. His hands reached for the desk to steady himself. Crawford produced more papers. Destruction of evidence. Documentation of treatment protocols deleted from the hospital system between 14:30 and 16:15 yesterday. IT confirms the user account was yours. He moved closer. The kind of slow walk that meant this was inevitable. Stand up, Doctor. The handcuffs snapped with the precision of 1,000 hospital protocols finally being enforced. Ashford's face went the color of surgical gauze, bloodless and stark. His attorney was already calculating sentences, plea deals, what remained of his life on the other side of privilege. Crawford read him his rights while the office staff watched with expressions that ranged from shock to something that looked like relief. The tension in the room released like air from a punctured lung, and what remained was just the ordinary hum of a hospital trying to save lives and finally removing the weight that had been standing on everyone's chest. They walked him past the nursing station where night shift staff stood motionless, watching the administrator, the man who'd made their schedules a weapon, their documentation a target, their loyalty a trap, being removed from the building he'd controlled like a tyrant. Past the break room where David Kumar and 3 other nurses watched with expressions shifting from fear to something that might become shame. Past Megan standing silent in the corridor with Tyler's arm around her shoulders, the shadow box still visible on the counter behind her, those medals catching the hallway light like evidence of everything she'd been and everything he'd tried to bury. Megan didn't move. Didn't acknowledge him. Her composure was a wall that he'd spent 18 hours trying to breach and would spend the next 6 years understanding he could never touch. She simply watched him pass with the particular attention of someone who had already decided his punishment was none of her concern. The real judgment would come from the mirror he'd face every morning for the rest of his life, from the mortgage payments on a house he could no longer afford, from the medical board that would revoke his license before the federal trial even concluded. The parking lot doors opened. The night air smelled like rain and diesel fuel and the particular absence of something that had been poisoning the air for 3 months. The FBI agents placed Dr. Ashford in the unmarked sedan with the competence of people who'd done this before, and Megan watched the taillights disappear into traffic without expression. Tyler squeezed her shoulder once. She nodded. Some victories didn't feel like celebrations. They felt like exhaling after holding your breath for 100 days. 18 months later, Seattle General in Raleigh looked different. The wall of excellence in the main lobby had new photographs. Megan's military portrait hung among them, her rank insignia crisp, the plaque beneath reading Director of Emergency Services in letters she could see from the security desk. The morning shift arrived at 6:45, the parking lot filling with nurses and residents and respiratory therapists carrying coffee that smelled like survival and routine. Megan walked through the entrance at 6:48, her limp still present but visible now, no longer something she tried to hide. Her bearing had changed. Her uniform fit differently. The timid nurse who'd accepted humiliation in silence had been replaced by someone whose presence made nurses straighten their posture and residents check their charts twice. The night security guard stood at the metal detector by the entrance. He was 64 years old now, his uniform the color of institutional compromise, his hands the hands of a man who would spend the rest of his life understanding what he'd lost. Dr. Ashford, never doctor again, never permitted to wear a white coat or sign orders or make treatment decisions, looked away as Megan approached. She didn't acknowledge him. Didn't speak. She simply walked past, as she did every morning, as she would do every morning for as long as he was forced to stand there and watch the woman he'd tried to destroy become the woman who would reshape every protocol in this hospital. Her office was on the 3rd floor. The window overlooked the emergency department, the machines beeping their steady rhythm, the controlled chaos of people trying to save lives. Colonel Marcus Hale sat in the visitor's chair, retired now from active service but consulting on military-civilian medical protocol integration. His wheelchair had been replaced with a cane he barely used anymore. His voice had regained the gravel it had carried in Tikrit before the pharmaceutical cocktail Ashford had ordered. Major. The DoD training program starts next month. Your staff ready? Ready, sir. She used his rank still, though the protocol had changed. Respect transcended retirement. Patricia Chen appeared in the doorway with the scheduled roster, her relationship with Megan rebuilt through months of earned trust and shared understanding that courage came in different uniforms. Tyler texted from his pre-med biology lecture, "Coffee after your shift?" She replied with a single word, "Yes." The morning briefing took place at 7 o'clock. The emergency department staff gathered in the conference room, nurses, residents, attending physicians, the people who held this place together during the hours when the machine screamed and the choices became binary. Megan stood at the front. She didn't raise her voice. Didn't need to. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. Every person who walks through those doors will remember how we treat them. Not the hospital. Us. Remember that. The staff listened with the attention of people who'd learned what happened when systems protected the wrong people. Some of them had been complicit in her exile. Most of them had simply been silent. Now silence wasn't permitted anymore. On her desk, the shadow box sat openly. Not hidden. Not something to be ashamed of. The medals arranged in ascending order of prestige, each one representing moments that had shaped her into the woman standing in this office making decisions that would determine how a hospital treated its most vulnerable. And in the center, the single dog tag on its repaired chain, the links new and strong where the old ones had broken on the day she'd first seen Colonel Hale's face and realized that some enemies never stayed buried. She closed the box with steady hands and walked onto the floor for morning rounds, stopping to correct a resident's chart, praise a nurse's quick thinking during a critical moment, approve a treatment protocol that would have been blocked 3 months ago if Ashford had still held authority. Outside the window, he checked IDs at the security desk, his hands trembling in ways that had nothing to do with age. He would spend his remaining years in that uniform, watching people enter the hospital she now directed, understanding with precision what it cost to underestimate someone because they'd learned to be quiet. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, this story is for you. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of hidden heroes, the quiet people who carry the most power, and the moment when the truth finally surfaces. Like this video, comment with your own experience of being misjudged, and let me know, would you have walked past him every day, or would you have said something? Let's talk in the comments below.